With the introduction of the new gen of consoles and the Xbox Series X, ray tracing has become a reality and something the Series X offers, which mostly just was not possible on last gen systems. For those who don't know though, ray tracing just refers to a technique that emulates how light would behave in the real world and how it interacts with everything else around it. So it can also be used when it comes to shadows and reflections in game, giving the scene a more realistic look. But the downside is that ray tracing is also taxing on the hardware, requiring more of the power in order for it to be implemented. So as is often the case, resolution or frame rates will be dropped in order to implement it. Many games though give gamers a choice as to which they want, to play with ray tracing or to have higher resolutions and better performance. But here are all the games on the Xbox Series X that allow you to play with ray tracing turned on. And also take note that some games may have ray tracing on PC but not on console at all, or it's still being worked on. Plus, I'm not including games that only have ray tracing turned on in photo modes or replays, for example. And also, these are not ranked either, but if you like the video, then please give it a thumbs up, share it, subscribe, and leave a comment as it helps the video get pushed out a lot more. Stop by the Discord, but now let's see which games you can play right now if you want to experience ray tracing and push the Xbox Series X hardware as far as possible right now. Let's go. So we start with Pumpkin Jack, the quirky Halloween platformer. One more for children, and I wouldn't call this a showcase of the system at all compared to some other games here, but at least there's a choice of having a higher resolution, targeting 4K 60, but if you're after ray tracing, then you're looking at a similar resolution target, but it runs at 30 frames per second, and I found this mode isn't ideal as it does have some stuttering, which isn't very good when it comes to platformers. Next we have Call of Duty Cold War, and why Vanguard didn't include ray tracing is unknown to me. But this one looks awesome in the visuals department, running at a dynamic 4K and 60 frames a second, plus ray tracing, which looks fantastic, especially when it comes to the ray trace shadows on display, and it really shows off what the Xbox Series X can do so early in its life cycle. The game can also be played at 120 frames per second in the campaign and multiplayer, but you don't get the benefit of ray tracing in those modes. Then there is CrossfireX, the unhyped, almost forgotten about multiplayer game, but also comes with a campaign from Remedy Games. Unfortunately, this one is a bit rough around the edges. Well, basically everywhere, but it does have ray tracing, but it's a bit shit in the campaign as it does have that slight stuttering associated with some games, especially at 30 frames a second, so it never feels very fluid. Even with the ray tracing mode enabled, it won't blow your socks off like other games on this list. You're better off sticking with the 60 frames per second mode. Next is Maneater, and how many games let you play as a shark, complete with your thirst for blood and human flesh? Not a whole lot, so if that sounds good, then Maneater is for you. Another one of the fewer games which offers up its visuals at 4K 60, plus the added benefit of ray tracing. The game can look quite good at times, especially when the glow of the sun is hitting the water just right, or you go underwater and look at the glow of the coral. The ray tracing improves reflections, both on the surface or when looking up from under the water. Then it's Dying Light 2, and this is another example of the frame rate taking a tumble if you opt for ray tracing. But if you can put up with a slight headache inducing low frame rate of 30 frames per second and first person motion sickness for some people, then the lighting and shadows definitely takes a step up, but the resolution is locked to 1080p. No dynamic scaling here, otherwise you can choose a higher resolution approaching 4K, still at 30 frames per second, or a performance mode at 1080p and 60, which is my preferred way to play. Resident Evil Village gets the ray tracing treatment too on the Xbox Series X, but I wouldn't say this will knock your eyeballs out of your head with how impressive it is. The reflections can be a bit low res, and the game still looks fantastic when ray tracing is turned off as well. The game runs at 4K and at 60 frames per second too, which is fantastic, with only slight dips here and there and at certain times, but again, the game looks excellent regardless what mode you play in. The Series S can struggle though, and doesn't always get a ray tracing mode, but it has one here, and yes, it's a bit shit. Leave it off. Doom Eternal comes chainsawing its way through your insides with its ray tracing mode, not like it really needed one, as the game is beautiful. From up close with the monsters in your face through to the backdrops and weapons, it's colourful and runs perfectly, but now offers ray tracing similar to a well-spec'd PC, and it retains its amazing performance but uses a dynamic res, or players can choose to turn off ray tracing altogether and have a flat 4K 60. Whichever you choose, Doom Eternal will make you cry tears of joy. Crysis Remastered also got the ray tracing treatment, and this was on the Xbox One X, and surprisingly, that was the best way to play it, as the other modes were quite shit. The game that used to make PC smoke, but here you can play the game the best it can be on consoles. Ray tracing at 60 frames per second with dynamic resolution, or you can opt for quality mode, which increases the maximum resolution at 60 frames per second, but not at 4K. But playing in either, I did experience fluctuations in the frame rate, so it isn't the best example of ray tracing out there. Then we have Life is Strange True Colors. I was a big fan of the first game and really enjoy this one too. And you can tell that there has been a bump up in visuals, not just with the ray tracing, but in the detail of the environments and characters, plus with some of the animations, including the facial movement. But the ray tracing helps, especially with more realistic shadows, but you do get a lower frame rate at 30 frames a second, and there is quite a bit of stutter. More than a Will Smith rap video from the early 90s. It's a great game though. The Guardians of the Galaxy also get in on the ray tracing treatment, and this had included a quality one at 30 frames per second at 4K, and a 1080p 60 frames a second mode, which still seems kind of low for the Xbox Series X, but it still looks phenomenal. Easily one of the best looking games, and which is included in another video. But now the quality mode gets ray tracing. It's still at 30 frames, but there has been improvements to the resolution, especially when it comes to more quiet or intense scenes. Awesome game, this one. Next is Ghostrunner, a bit of a gem if you ask me, but not for the faint of heart, as this game can be tough. But if you can master the controls and movement, then it's also fantastic. And this also offers you a couple of modes too. So we have the 4K 60 with ray tracing enabled, but in my experience, it can tend to dip frames and have some slight stuttering, which gets a little annoying, as you really want a flawless experience when playing this intense, free-running hack and slash game. It also looks fantastic with a great cyberpunk world, underrated gem. Then it's Hood, the game which seemed to drop. Then it wasn't so much an issue of people forgetting about it, it was more like they didn't seem to give a shit before it was released or when it came out. But of course, it does have ray tracing and runs at a fairly smooth 60 frames per second from what I've played, and it can be quite a good looking game at times. I just wish it was more single player or co-op focused with some storytelling. Hellblade also received the ray tracing update, so it takes an already great looking game and gives it even more features to please the eyes. So players get 3 modes now, and the ray tracing one runs at 30 frames per second with a dynamic 4K image. And even the Series S receives a ray tracing mode at 30 frames at full HD. There are also modes for 4K at 60 with no ray tracing on the Series X, plus a 120 frames per second mode. Series S also has a 60 frames a second mode as well. If you haven't played Hellblade yet, give it a try before the sequel comes out. Then we have Control Ultimate Edition, which comes with 2 modes and is one of those games where you really are choosing performance or ray tracing, and the experiences are quite different. So this version packs a 1440p resolution in each mode, which is upscaled, and you have the choice of 60 frames per second with no ray tracing, or 30 with ray tracing, which adds much more realistic reflections to the game. But personally, I just have to play Control at 60 frames as it just feels so much better. Ray tracing be damned. Devil May Cry 5 also gets a number of modes, perhaps too many, but of course there are ray tracing modes which favour visual quality or performance, where the latter drops the res down to 1080 but holds a much better frame rate, and depending on which modes you choose, that will be based upon how susceptible you are to frame rate drops and how much you can tell the difference with the quality of the ray tracing and increased resolutions. But it can look especially nice when seeing the environment being reflected in puddles realistically. Then we have the medium, and this is probably known more for its ray tracing mode than actually being all that great, as I found it quite uneventful and not scary. And when it comes to the technical side of things, it's a dynamic 4K on the Series X and 1080p on the Series S, and it all runs at 30 frames per second. It can look quite good at times when it comes to the details in a scene and the backgrounds, and ray tracing is mostly used for the reflections on the Series X, with the Series S missing out completely in that department. The sci-fi mystery of Observer also comes packing ray tracing, which can make this neon-filled and dark world come to life more, and this is also from Bloober Team, who did the medium, so they are a bit hit and miss for me in terms of quality. But of course, this will improve the lighting if you decide to play in ray tracing mode, but you definitely take a hit to the frame rate and it can stutter quite a bit, whereas by turning it off, the experience becomes much more enjoyable to play. The system Redux version also improves textures, environmental effects, and also has HDR, which really helps with this style of game too. Metro Exodus also comes packing the ray tracing feature, and this was a game which would already melt your eyeballs, especially on the One X, but now it's even better and closer to what the PC experience is. With a dynamic resolution that looks fantastic, the frame rate is bumped up to 60 frames per second, just like we want, a huge increase from last gen, plus the inclusion of ray tracing makes the lighting and shadows seem much more realistic. For Series S owners, you also get 60 frames per second and ray tracing, but the resolution drops a lot and struggles to even hit 1080p, so expect some or a lot of blurriness. A stunning game made even more stunning on Series X especially. Next is Myst, and for anyone who gamed in the 90s, then you'll definitely know this game, but it has been remade, and of course there's a night and day difference between that version and this one, so for anyone looking to hurt their brain with a puzzler, then this could be for you. Plus it utilizes Fidelity FX, which I won't discuss here, but go read up on it if you enjoy the tech behind games. The Myst remake allows for a 4K image at 60 with some great lighting to really bring this game to life. Then we have Enlisted, which isn't a bad game from what I've played so far, but if you're sick of playing Call of Duty 38 or Battlefield 2040 shithouse, then give this World War II squad-based shooter a try, even if you've probably played at least 10 of them in the last 5 years. So here of course you get a more realistic lighting system which looks good on these large outdoor maps, and because of that too, shadows are cast all over the place as well to show off what really couldn't be done on consoles last gen. Chivalry 2 also gets the ray tracing treatment to really bring this multiplayer medieval hack and slash game to life. You can play in the first or third person perspective, and these games are always best played when teamed with friends and family where you're all mic'd up. This can be quite a good looking game at times, but those playing on Xbox Series X will need to decide what's more important from a technical performance standpoint. If you choose ray tracing, then the game is going to be capped at 30 frames, or you can disable it and run the game at 60. Or if you're feeling like you're wanting to have a bit of a shit experience, then choose the uncapped frame rate. Call of the Sea also comes with ray tracing, but I doubt this will blow you away with its implementation. But still, this game has a great stylized look about it, plus it's a very good game. Xbox Series X gets the ray tracing treatment and it runs at 60 frames, but at 1440p resolution, whilst the Series S drops that down to dynamic 1080p. But even if it isn't the most impressive game here, it still looks good and is worthwhile playing. Then it's Watch Dogs Legion, and I feel like I've spoken about this game so many times, but it is one of the most visually impressive games out there with a great open world, but now the world gets reflected and brought to life even more through ray tracing. But the Series X targets a 4K resolution at 30 with ray tracing enabled, and even the Series S gets ray tracing at 1080p and 30 frames a second, which is pretty damn impressive considering it's a great looking game and it's open world. Then it's the NBA 2K series, and this was a huge improvement when comparing to the last gen versions, and the visuals really do pop, with colours being so vibrant, plus the reflections off of the court's surface, plus the character models as well. It all looks great and sets itself apart from the older consoles. Series S of course knocks the resolution down, so if you can, the Series X versions are definitely a step up. Gears 5 also gets some ray tracing love, but whereas every other game on the list is using the ray tracing hardware in the box itself, Gears 5 implements a software ray tracing mode, so it isn't the same as using the dedicated hardware, but it's still a step up from what came before. Plus Gears 5 already looked incredible, and it's a definite showcase for whichever Xbox console you play it on. The Riftbreaker also has the feature, and this one runs at 4K 60 frames with ray tracing on the Xbox Series X, whereas it runs at 4K 60 frames on the Series S. But the ray tracing also doesn't include all the bells and whistles, with the shadows getting most of the attention on the Xbox Series X. It may not be the most stunning game here, but for this type of game, it certainly has some great visuals and effects going on. Then there is Poker Club, and there is only going to be so much which the devs can do with a game like this that's going to wow you, but ray tracing is here, and it's used primarily when it comes to reflections and shadows, but for a poker game, this is quite good looking. Not one for everyone, or to really see what can tax the hardware on the Series X or S, but poker is very popular. Now it looks even better. So there are all the ray tracing games that I could find that you can play right now on your Xbox Series X, and with some certain games, You can also get the option of ray tracing on the Series S. There are other games which have ray tracing in photo mode, or it may be only on PC, but which games have impressed you most when it comes to their ray tracing implementation, or which games do you think just look drop dead gorgeous? Please leave a comment down below and let me know, as it helps a lot to push the video out. Give it a thumbs up, share it, hit the subscribe button and stop by the Discord, and with that, I'll see you next time.